Good morning. All aboard. Had to do that. I'm Bruce Hyer. This is Elizabeth May. And we have problems with Via Rail and passenger rail in Canada. We're the only developed country in the world that is not investing in passenger rail. We're going the other way. We're reducing our investments, and we call them subsidies. In the USA, Amtrak is being supported by the Obama administration and is increasing its trackage, its routes, its commitment. It's put good legislation in place, and it has sustainable funding, and they have connectivity. In Canada, those things are not happening and have not happened for a long time. Here in Canada, we have no vision, we have no strategy, we have no legislation, and we have no sustainable funding for passenger rail in Canada. We have no federal leadership at all. In some ways, this is a simple issue. In some ways, it's a very complex issue. Consultant Greg Gormick, transportation consultant, and I have been working on this 90-page report for over a year. I encourage you to read it. We're not going to be able to cover 90 pages of detailed history and analysis here this morning. We're only going to be able to hit the high points. We have it available on a CD as a PDF, or you can take a hard copy of the report itself. And we have an executive summary that we have prepared that's on the counter here. I'm just going to hit a few high points. Why passenger train? Well, I think the biggest reason is a lot of Canadians want it, but they've stopped taking it because it's not convenient, it's not on time, and it's overpriced, and it's not dependable. But it is the safest form of ground transportation, of any kind of transportation. It's the most energy efficient of all the land transport systems. It has the lowest environmental footprint. It has a high degree of passenger comfort. I take it a lot, and believe me, I know how comfortable it is. I can get work done on Via Rail. It is accessible to seniors, and it's accessible to people in wheelchairs and with other disabilities that are difficult for other means of transportation. And it works in all kinds of weather. Every time we have a hurricane or 4 days of snow and our flights are grounded, most of the time passenger rail could be very easily running during those times. And it's a good investment. For every $1 million that we invest in passenger rail, and other countries have, it's demonstrated that there's at least a 3-time multiplier, and we get $3 million or more in economic development. What are the main challenges to VIA? The first is no federal rail strategy of any kind, no leadership. The second is lack of sustainable funding, adequate and sustainable funding for VIA. No investments, or not enough investments, not the right kind. It has a board of directors that quite clearly is not committed to a sustainable national rail network. The only rail network that they're really interested in is the Quebec Southern Ontario corridor, and they're abandoning the rest of Canada. It has passive and active resistance by our two main freight lines, CN and CP, to passenger rail service on their lines. And then the really big one is a lack of adequate legislation. In the United States, there is a National Amtrak Rail Act. We need a Canada Via Rail Act badly. We need it. We've needed it for a long time. The Mulroney government commissioned the big rail task force back in 1984 and 85. And what they said was that specific legislation for Via Rail was absolutely necessary, to use their words. But politically, it just hasn't happened, and we don't have a National Via Rail Act. So, to summarize, and then I'm looking forward to seeing what Elizabeth May wants to also say about this. It is long overdue for some vision, some leadership, some funding, some sustainability, some commitment by the federal government to passenger rail in Canada. Elizabeth.
Well, I want to thank my colleague, independent Bruce Hyer of Thunder Bay Superior North, for taking the initiative to commission a study. This is extremely useful, welcome information, and I hope we're going to be able to find it on your website, because it's all Canadians need to read the history of Via Rail as prepared.
It is on brucehyer.ca.
Good.
This morning. On
brucehyer.ca this morning you can find this report. Coincidentally, both as leader of the Green Party and as an individual, I've been a huge supporter of Via Rail for decades, but certainly the Green Party policy is forcefully in favor of investing in our trains and having a national rail service. I wrote to Marc Laliberté, President and CEO of Via Rail, back in January of this year, detailing new policies recently implemented by Via Rail that seem designed to drive down ridership. They're so counterintuitive that you can't believe a system of transportation that wants ridership would take on board policies like insisting that people put bags on separate trains instead of allowing people, as we used to, carry our own bag on board and stow it. They've changed the system of having fewer trains available, so that when you go on the Via Rail website to book your train, you're told it's sold out. They never used to do that. They just added another rail car. You don't tell people they can't get on aboard a train. They've cut service across Canada in ways that are absolutely detrimental to people ever being able to count on trains. Now, this report, which is great, focuses for good reason, because Bruce is Thunder Bay Superior North, on the deterioration of trains serving Ontario's North Shore. I see it across the country. We used to have 6 trains a week between Montreal and Halifax. Now we have 3. We used to have much better service between Toronto and the West. There are serial cutbacks that suggest to me a threat, which I put in this letter to Monsieur Laliberté, that I was concerned that they were preparing to get rid of Toronto to Vancouver and privatize it, Montreal to Halifax and privatize it, and only have Via Rail concentrate on the Quebec-Windsor corridor. This is a concern that I see based on the changes in policy and where money is being spent. And then, lo and behold, this large piece of research confirms my intuitions and fears in the way that Greg Gormick sees the way Via Rail is spending money, where the cuts are taking place, and the lack of commitment to passenger rail service in Canada. We need to be investing in passenger rail. We need to modernize passenger rail. Barack Obama in the U.S. is going to have a high-speed rail system that goes from New York to Montreal. That'll be the only high-speed rail any Canadians can reach. You can get on board a train in Montreal and eventually get to high-speed rail. This is a very serious issue when we have the world-leading innovator in high-speed rail, being Bombardier, selling trains everywhere in the world, but not even bothering to have a Canadian sales office for high-speed rail. They're building trains, yes, in China, big country, large territory. The reasons we're told we can't have high-speed rail here, long distances. They're doing it in China. Compact countries, Europe, Spain, France, they're doing high-speed rail. Why do we not have an investment in our trains? Je peux ajouter seulement quelques mots en français. C'est absolument primordial pour l'avenir d'un pays industrialisé d'avoir un système ferroviaire qui marche. À ce moment, nous devrions investir en les trains dans un système ferroviaire. C'est essentiel. Le Canada est le seul pays dans toute l'organisation de coopération et de développement mondial économique sans stratégie de transport national. Tous les autres pays du monde investir dans les systèmes ferroviaires, mais le Canada, à ce moment, nous sommes dans le dernier rang avec les investissements, pas des trains de grande vitesse. Et en effet, notre réseau ferroviaire a besoin de faire peau neuve. C'est pourquoi il faudrait plutôt chercher à améliorer l'efficacité des services voyageurs et le transport des marchandises. Parce que le système ferroviaire est plus efficace, plus écolo, et comme Bruce Hyer a dit, c'est un système qui c'est possible de faire le travail dans le train. C'est un système convenient, mais avec le système sans investir, c'est un système qui était à ce moment menacé par la mauvaise gestion et parce que nous manquons ici au Canada la volonté en politique pour améliorer la service ferroviaire. So I'm very, very grateful that Bruce has produced this report, and I hope it will stimulate those within the current Conservative administration who care about Via Rail, and there are some identified in this report by Greg Gormick, identifies those champions within Mr. Harper's cabinet who want to do more. Canadians need to know there's a threat to Via Rail so that they can encourage those members of the Harper cabinet who want to make sure the trains remain on track. Thank you.
I'd just like to add to that there are rail supporters, Via Rail supporters, and the National Rail Strategy supporters in all the parties. And many of them wanted to be here this morning and were quite interested, have copies of the report, but the whips wouldn't let them come. Just one more piece of evidence that things are far too tribal around here, and our MPs are taking the direction from the parties and the whips, not from their constituents or the issues that they're passionately concerned about. So there were a good dozen that really wanted to be here today and were quite candid in saying their whips wouldn't let them come. It isn't that sad. So we're open to questions or comments now if anybody has any. Tom.
Can I ask the implication for either or both of you, the implication of a Via Rail bill, it seems to be that it forces members of Parliament to make an emotional investment in the service in their particular area that does not exist when it's run by order in council. Is that what I'm getting? Is that why you need the bill?
The opposite, actually, Tom. Right now, Via Rail is subject to the political whims of cabinet decisions that are always looking to, especially with this government, privatize everything and reduce costs, at least ostensibly reduce costs in the public service areas. They want to do it in many areas, education, healthcare, the list goes on. So this is a government that doesn't really believe in supplying public services in many areas. If we had the right kind, as the U.S. does with its Amtrak legislation, long-term commitments enforced in law, it would force a longer-term vision, longer-term sustainability. And the other thing it would do, there are things in the U.S. legislation that force the freight rail companies, including CN, to accommodate the needs of passenger rail. So CN has actually been forced in the U.S. by that legislation and by the Obama administration to provide better and faster, more timely and more economical service to passenger rail, to Amtrak. Where here is in Canada, I know all too well as a rider of Via, how often you get put on a siding while CN freights go rumbling by, and once they lose their priority, and they don't have to get very far behind in their timing to lose their priority, it gets worse and worse and worse and worse. So I think it would depoliticize things. It would be political in the short term to get the legislation through, and would it be a challenge? Absolutely. But this is a role that both are, if the Senate has a role, it's in their committees. And so the transportation committees of both the House and the Senate would be a logical step to do real studies. They don't have to redo many of them. Many of them have already been done, review the evidence, and develop a real plan and recommend it to Parliament, hopefully a nonpartisan, cross-party lines piece of legislation.
And can I ask,
did you want to add anything to that, Elizabeth?
For both or either of you, there have been some well-meaning transport ministers over the year. Collinette was a train guy.
Yes.
Is there a sense that Via is where it is because there's never been a national consensus in the electorate or stakeholders or a period on the function of a rail system and a car driving population?
As the report makes clear, the investments, the formation of Via Rail, some of the things that in the short term seemed like positive developments have all had an eye to putting a cap on what they call the subsidies, what I would call the investments to Via Rail. For example, why don't we have a share of the national gas tax going to Via Rail? the most energy efficient of all the ground transportation routes, where we have massive subsidies to airports and to highways. We call those investments, but for some bizarre reason, we call investments in via rail or any rail system as subsidies.
I just want to add to that. I mean, and this report also buttresses this problem, buttresses the evidence for this problem. Via rail was created in ways that stack the deck against it. Number one, it doesn't own its own tracks. So with freight owning the tracks and owning the the traffic lights, you have a system, as Bruce just said, where passenger rail is going to have to wait to make sure freight isn't late. So reliability of schedules is a huge challenge for via rail because they are legitimately unable, with the contracts they have with CNCP and different parts of tracks across Canada, able to promise a ridership that you're going to get there on time. And with increasingly long freight trains, the freight trains are now longer than they were historically. They don't fit on sidings. So you have sidings that are relatively infrequent along a rail line. The freight will say to passenger rail, move over, because there's a long freight train coming. And passenger rail has no choice. You can't exactly say we're going to play chicken with you on the tracks. Passenger rail has to move over. So that set the deck against via rail. The other problem is that we are prepared to absorb massive hundreds of millions of dollars of subsidies to our highways without any notion that there's user pay. And we don't ever say, gee, our highways are losing money. But with a rail system that we ought to be supporting, because it's what links us east-west. It's a fantastic opportunity for Canadians, and it's also much more economical for families than air travel. There are a lot of good reasons why we should, as a matter of good economics, keep a modern, efficient train system on track. But it's judged in this skewed way that it's somehow a subsidy and somehow via rail should be paying for itself. And this report includes some very good quotes from the former CEO of Amtrak, who said people need to realize that in no country on earth does train travel pay for itself. Neither does using the highways pay for itself. These are functions of an infrastructure of a modern country, and you either have them or you don't care about them. But right now we need to really invest in via, and we need to return and restore service to more remote areas. The cutbacks and the loss of service, of course, contribute to lower ridership. And as I point out, I'll give you a copy of this letter if you're interested, the numerous new policies in the last 6 months that appear designed to drive away even a loyal customer of via like me. As I said in my letter to Mr. La Liberté, my grandfather used to say, just as an expression, this is no way to run a railroad. Well, that seems to be their motto at via right now.
And then I'd just like to add one small thing. I've repeatedly said here we need leadership. If I were the Ministry of Transport, could happen someday, never know, I would drag CN and CP into a back room and I would say, would you like me to be your best friend or not? We need some leverage. We also need the legislation to empower that kind of action. But we've given away our national railroad, CN, and we basically gave it away to CP. And back in the days of Sir John A. Macdonald, creating CP was a great thing, but it was created privately. They were given land grants all across Canada, and they're a Canadian creation. They were created by John A. Macdonald and the Canadian government. It's time for us to get firm again with our national freight railways and make them understand this is not a hindrance, this is a responsibility and a duty.
I just have one more question. I'm not a railway attorney. My understanding is that over the years, I know Alberta looked at this briefly in the 80s when they shut down the Dayliner between Calgary and Edmonton, of running their own passenger service. Those provinces that have done their own rail service have had to build the track themselves, as you point out. Is there any merit in doing with rail what they did do with highways? Feed it out to the provinces, release the mandates to local legislatures. If they want to have the service, they can.
There's some merit to what you're suggesting. The problem is, though, that when we're talking about a national network of railways, we need connectivity with other modes of transportation. We need connectivity at provincial boundaries. We need standards. Canada has standards on almost nothing. You may be aware that we don't do national standards very much like most countries do. I think we have national standards for seat belts, but not a whole lot else. This is an area where we not only need leadership, but we need that legislation and we need national standards.
Yeah, can I just add, I think I'm prompted by your reference to Edmonton to Calgary. The Conference Board of Canada has found that it would actually make money. That's one of the runs where the market is there and the resources are there to see high-speed rail pay for itself. So Edmonton-Calgary would be a tremendous first run at high-speed rail. Who's most likely to build it, Via or the government of Alberta? Maybe the government of Alberta wants to do that. It would be an extremely visionary step, and it would show the rest of Canada what high-speed rail could do. I think your question opens up the point that if we're not talking about our rail system, which we're not, we're seeing, and this report, demonstrates that there is a systematic reduction of service and decisions that are being made that imperil the existence of a national passenger rail service. So shouldn't we be having that conversation? Maybe we should be having a national dialogue in which people get to say, well, yeah, okay, maybe the provinces could do this part. No, Via Rail needs its own legislation. Let's at least have the conversation. And that's why I'm very grateful to Bruce for commissioning this report. Because right now, dramatic changes are happening. People who understand Via Rail see these changes. Certainly, the laid-off workers, and there are hundreds of them in the last couple of budgets from Via Rail, see these changes and see that there is a threat to the existence of a reliable passenger rail service in Canada. It's not being talked about. So at least let's have the conversation and figure out, do we want legislation for Via Rail the way Amtrak has legislation? Do we want to invest? Do we want to, as Bruce suggests, explain nicely to the people who own the tracks that they better be cooperative? We need a much better deal for Via Rail if we're going to have a train service in the future. And it's really essential, to see Canada lose Sir John A. Macdonald's national dream and see key areas shut down from access to trains. And then, by the way, we don't have guaranteed bus service either for a lot of these communities. This is very essential nation-building stuff, and we ought to be talking about it.
One of the client groups that I've heard from more than any other is seniors. There are a lot of seniors in this country that want to visit their grandchildren. They want to go to their local regional center for shopping or medical work or legal work. And sometimes in bad weather, and for some of them, they can't drive it at all anymore. And in many places, as Elizabeth has pointed out, bus service has been terminated or is poor. They desperately need rail that's safe, secure, all weather, so that seniors aren't trapped in their homes and their small communities. Any other questions?
Are you saying that if things continue the way they are, that we risk losing passenger service altogether? Or?
It is very clear to me that the Via Board of Directors sees the only potential for profit being the Quebec-Windsor Toronto corridor, Southern Ontario corridor, and that they want to dismantle, allegedly in the names of privatizing, but it's not going to happen, our national rail service. We've seen steady cuts. Something that I'd like to draw your attention to is...
Sorry, I put my papers on top of your papers.
Somewhere here. Well, over here, I have a graph of the cuts since 1977. And it'll be made instantly clear to you with that graphic exactly what has been happening. Just a steady death by 1,000 cuts. And Via is on its last legs. If we don't restore it, save it, invest in it now, it won't last too much longer. Thank you.